Today, I will be talking about my research on activism and mobilization in the United States. For my presentation, I will be comparing recent mobilizations, that is, since the Trump administration took office in January 2017, all the way through the most recent mobilizations in the United States, including the post-George Floyd Black Lives Matter protests, as well as protests around climate change and the youth climate strikes. I'll be comparing those different forms of mobilizations on the left to the mobilizations that we've seen on the right in the United States, particularly around white supremacy, as well as the insurrection that happened at the US Capitol on January 6th. Some of the big highlights from my talk will be the ways that the left and the right, broadly speaking, are mobilizing activism using very different tactics. On the left, we see tactics that are much more connected to electoral politics. And many of the organizations that coordinate this type of activism specifically work to channel what we consider to be outrage in the form of moral outrage into resistance in the streets that then translates into resistance through electoral politics. So resistance at the ballot box, if you will. So in American Resistance, I specifically discuss the mobilization on the left in response to the Trump administration and the Trump administration's policies during the period of time when Donald Trump was in office, and how we saw mobilization in the streets in terms of what I call resistance in the streets, that is activism through manifestation and protests broadly. And I track the way that these protests channeled people's outrage and activism into resistance in people's congressional districts, which is where people vote, around electoral politics. More recently, we've seen a connection between these broad-based left-leaning movements and more specific movements against systemic racism, as well as against the climate crisis, as the climate crisis becomes larger and people feel the exacerbation of the climate crisis. That's very different from the way that we see tactics being engaged and embraced by people on the right in the United States. Although during the Obama administration, there were many cases of this Tea Party movement emerging, which was focused very much, again, on taking outrage against the Obama administration in that case and channeling it into activism within congressional districts at the local political level. We have not seen any emergence of a new Tea Party, if you want to talk about it that way. Instead, what we're seeing is much more confrontational activism that is embracing tactics such as conflict, aggressions against political or elected officials. So we see it even at the local level with school boards. There's been a lot of activism and mobilization against school boards and the ways that they're including critical race theory in their programs for education. But we also see it around COVID and mask mandates, which is the requirement of wearing a mask within schools, within institutional offices. And we also see it with these vaccine requirements, which are becoming more centrally coordinated in the United States, and at the same time we see a lot of mobilizations against these vaccine and masking mandates at the local level. And much of that activism becomes much more confrontational, targeting specific elected officials using the tactic called doxing, where elected officials' personal identities, their personal locations, are released publicly, and then people end up not just being trolled online, but we see activists coming to people's houses, and in some cases there's a threat of violence. And we see threats of violence taking place across the United States, and that ends up being coordinated through activism like the type that we saw, which became violent in January at the US Capitol. So that's the discussion, and I'll talk about how we see really a diverting of tactics being used, and it's unclear what the right will do, whether the right will continue to move towards these more aggressive confrontational techniques for trying to achieve its goals, or if instead what we'll see is a redirection towards much more locally embedded institutional type politics on the right. At the same time, and this is how I will be ending my conversation, at the same time on the left, there's no question that there will be a continuation of these, the channeling of the outrage and concern that continues on the left in the United States towards very institutional political politics. And we'll see that around the Supreme Court. We'll see that around the congressional elections, which will take place in 2022. So there's already a lot of discussion around that. What we'll see after President Biden's 4 years are up, as President Biden made it clear he would not run for a second term given his age. So there will be another opportunity for coordination for electoral politics. And so much of my work has focused on looking in North America, in Europe. I've collected data in many countries in Europe, much of it here in France, as well as in Asia, looking specifically in Japan. So I can tell you that the comparison there's a lot of really interesting comparisons about the role that citizens feel they play within civil society and in terms of the role that they see themselves playing in democracy. I think that here in France we have some of the best examples of a really active democracy where citizens see a very important role for themselves as actors who are pressuring institutional political channels and institutional political representation using these tactics like protest. In terms of thinking about how this works across the Americas, and when we look south, there is a really different sense of the importance of the liberal democratic state and the role that citizens play in having a say as well as in directing opportunities within the nation state. And so when we see protests there, it tends to be much more of what we call an outsider tactic. That means it's very much seen as outside of the political process, and it's seen as more of the way that people who feel like they have very few other opportunities to engage politically will go into the streets. And that's really different from in France, where citizens have many different roles that they play within the political system, whereas les manifestations is one of the different tools in their democratic toolbox, if you think about it that way. Same in the United States. In fact, I think that until recently in the United States, the toolbox for a citizen only had a very small space for the role of protest, but that space has grown quite a bit since Donald Trump took office and since he's left office even. And that, is in some ways following the example that we see here in France. But I think that that's a really different, is a different role for protests and activism and mobilizations broadly when citizens have many different avenues to pressure their governments. Whereas I think in many of the Central and South American countries, we see that there are many fewer channels, and therefore it takes a lot more activation energy, if you want to think of it that way, to mobilize people to get out in the streets. But once they do, they have fewer limitations on them because they see it as their only opportunity. So that's the best I can do for comparison. I have not done research in Central and South America, but there are some really interesting opportunities for comparison there for sure.